A push. It's time for our second part of the APUSH Unit 4 review. We are in my least favorite time period, 1800 to 1848. Not a tremendous amount of action going on, but we do get to talk about some 18th century, some 19th century reforms, which is good stuff. So I think you guys are going to love it. Our must-know terms. We got all the political stuff we talked about in part one. We talked about Federalists. We talked about Democratic Republicans, the Democrats and the Whigs, the Second Great Awakening. We're going to talk about the abolition movement. We'll talk about the women's rights movement, the market revolution, all that good stuff we talk about right now. Our period from 1800 to 1848, we got two key dates. 1800 is the election of Jefferson. 1848 is our Seneca Falls Convention. The new republic struggled to define and extend democratic ideals in the face of rapid economic, territorial, and demographic changes. So we talked about the territorial changes. There's lots of territorial changes in this time period, but the extension of democratic ideals and the economic changes we haven't yet talked about. So when we look at our key themes, generally what's going on in the time period, first of all, more and more states are adopting universal white manhood suffrage. And with that, we start to see the Democratic Party emerge as the party of the common man, the party of the people. They elect Andrew Jackson as president in 1829, which is a huge victory for the Democrats. We also talked about the territorial expansion because of the Louisiana Purchase during Jefferson, the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was the Florida Purchase Treaty in 1819. We have yet to talk about the Mexican-American War, Oregon, and Maine. But other things to discuss, the market revolution, it's going to drastically accelerate the American economy, making it one of the massive producing economies in the entire world. But due to the nature of the new technology and where this technology is used, it's only going to lead to more sectionalism and sectional economies. And then the Second Great Awakening leads to those social reforms, most notably the abolition movement. Okay, so we started in Texas. So we had the aforementioned Adams-Onis Treaty, otherwise known as the Florida Purchase Treaty in 1819. This gave the United States Florida, and in return, the United States traded away our claims to Mexico to Spain. However, Spain loses Mexico because Mexico declares its independence in 1821 with the famous Father Miguel Hidalgo ringing the church bells and starting this Creole Revolution, and now the Mexicans are independent of Spain. Now, the Spanish government had promised some land to a man, Stephen Austin's father, and this new Mexican government, drastically needing money, is going to honor that agreement and give a land grant to an American, Stephen Austin. He pays for this. The Mexican government drastically needed the money, but there are certain stipulations that Stephen Austin must follow in order to move into Texas. Number one, he can only bring in a maximum of 300 American families. Number two, they must all be Roman Catholics. Our Mexicans are heavily, heavily Catholic. And number three, they are supposed to integrate into Mexican society, and they surely cannot bring slaves because Mexico has already banned slavery. However, each and every one of these things is going to be broken by our Texans. By 1835, there were 30,000 Texas Americans. They were predominantly Protestant, and yes, they brought their slaves with them. Friction is going to emerge over slavery and the amount of immigrants that are coming into Mexico, especially after Mexico emancipated its slaves in 1830 and prohibited more slaves coming into Texas. This is going to cause Stephen Austin to go down to try and negotiate with the Mexican government. The current dictator, the Caudillo of Mexico, was Jose de Lopez de Santa Anna. And Santa Anna is going to throw Stephen Austin in jail for 8 months. And finally, he's going to say, Texas, if you're not going to listen to the laws, then we are going to remove your right to government, raise an army, and come in and push you out of Texas. And that is exactly what he intends to do in 1835. He rises up his army, And then the Texans respond by declaring their own independence. You can't tell us what to do, the Texans say. So Santa Anna moves in with his army, traps 200 Texans in an old Spanish mission called the Alamo, and each and every one of these Texans die at the Alamo. This is a move that is very much a matter of perspective. From the Mexican perspective, they went in and killed the outlaws, the bandits that were selfishly bringing in slaves into their country. But from the American perspective, this is a murder of their countrymen. Those savage Mexicans came in and killed all of those poor Americans who were just trying to live their own lives in Texas. This becomes a rallying cry for Americans, especially Americans in the South, to go in and avenge these American lives lost. Remember the Alamo is yelled throughout the South, and hundreds and then thousands of Americans volunteer to go to Texas to avenge the Alamo. And that sets up the famous Battle of San Jacinto. The Battle of San Jacinto is when Sam Houston, a drunk, is going to rally many Americans to come together and march on Santa Anna's army. Santa Anna retreats and retreats on his way back to Mexico. However, Sam Houston's men catches Santa Anna during a siesta in the middle of the day. They're sleeping, and the battle really only takes about 12 seconds before the Mexican forces are completely surrounded. Santa Anna is found hovering in the bushes. They put a Bowie knife up to his throat and say, "You must sign 2 treaties. You need to, 1, recognize Texas independence, and 2, you need to recognize the Rio Grande River as the southern border of Texas." Santa Anna has no choice. He's got a bow knife to his neck, and he must, in fact, agree to these stipulations. However, once he is released and allowed to return to Mexico City, he immediately renounces these treaties and says, these treaties have no legal merit because I signed them under duress. Therefore, I do not recognize Texas's independence. And if there was, in fact, a colony in rebellion known as Texas, the southern border would not be the Rio Grande, it would be the Nueces River. And so we have a very, very interesting situation on our hands where Texas is this independent state, or is it? Is it still part of Mexico? It depends on who you ask. And then where is the boundary? Is it here at the Nueces River, or is it all the way down here to the Rio Grande River? Doesn't matter at this stage because, of course, Texas will be annexed right into the Union. Or will it? Texas is going to formally petition to join the Union in 1837. This huge amount of land that the United States could readily enter into the Union, but they don't do it. The United States spurns Texas. And why? The answer is very simple: the slavery issue. Since the first 13 colonies, we have been adding in states one by one, and chronologically we have added them free state, slave state along the way, keeping the delicate free state, slave state balance alive. If Texas comes into the Union, it will upset this delicate balance. And now, here we are in the 1830s, the abolitionist sentiment is rising in the North. This could be a scheme by the Southerners to bring in more slave states into the Union, and we simply cannot allow that. For this reason, Texas remains an independent country for 9 years, to the point where it's making formal peace treaties and alliances with countries like France and Belgium. Crazy stuff going on in Texas. And then back in the Union, we have politics as usual. So we actually finished our last discussion. We ended with Jackson and then his chosen successor, Martin Van Buren, who, the luckless man, unfortunately, is stuck with a major panic right when he becomes president, becomes a very unpopular president. And because of this, this gives the Whigs, a new party, a chance to get who they want into the presidency. As the Whigs often do, they are going to pick a war hero. They pick William Henry Harrison. Old Tippecanoe himself won a key victory against Tecumseh back in the Indian War era. And because of this, they put him on as their ticket, and they published absolutely no political platform. In fact, how could they publish a political platform given that the Whigs have so many different sections that make up this patchwork party. They've got the anti-Masons. They've got the New England manufacturers. They've got the big plantation owners down in South Carolina that were upset by Andrew Jackson and the nullification crisis, right? The Whigs are just a bunch of people that really disliked Andrew Jackson and came together in a party. And so how could they publish a platform? They couldn't. And in fact, the leader of the Whigs, the mastermind, Henry Clay, knows that if they just keep silent and try to ride on William Henry Harrison's popularity, they might just make it through. But they'll have to defeat the Democratic Party, which to this point has been able to call themselves the party of the common man. But wait, there is a huge mistake made by a Democratic editor when he calls William Henry Harrison an impoverished old farmer, content with a log cabin, a barrel of hard cider, the poor Westerner champagne. What a mistake this is, because this is the Whigs' opportunity to claim, aha, yes, he is an old farmer. He is living in a log cabin. He is representing the West. This is the chance for the Whigs to adopt the common man ideology that has been so successful for the Democrats in the Jacksonian era. And then they're able to call the Democrats the party of aristocracy. And of course, it's all a sham, because William Henry Harrison, in fact, lives on a large plantation with over 100 slaves in a 16-room mansion. But that doesn't matter. It only matters about perception. And the Whigs call Harrison the father of North Bend. And they are going to ride this popularity of the common man right into the presidency. And so what this election of 1840 shows is that in order to win elections, you must connect with the newly enfranchised common man. And we have these two still very, very diverse parties right now, the Whigs and the Democrats. And as long as we have non-sectional parties, meaning we don't have a party that is only the North or only the South, we are going to prevent a civil war from occurring. But as soon as we see a sectional party, that's when a civil war is going to occur. Okay. This antebellum period, especially the 1840s to 1860, is a period of very, very, very high immigration. We have two periods of very high immigration in American history. One is right before the Civil War, 1840 to 1860. The other one is after the Civil War, 1880 to 1920. We have different immigrants in these different eras. In this first era, it's all about the Irish and the Germans. But there are some similarities between immigration at any point in American history. Why are people immigrating to the United States? It's largely for these major reasons: land and opportunity. That's the biggest reason right there. We also have religious freedom in the United States, unlike places, for instance, Ireland, who is still under the yoke of the English, the heavily Protestant English. The Irish, of course, virtually all Catholic. And so this presents an opportunity to escape the religious persecution of the old world. More to that in a second. First of all, by 1850, already the United States is the fourth largest country in the Western world, behind Austria and France and Russia. And more immigrants are pouring in each and every year. Another reason why these immigrants are coming into the United States now is because of the invention of the steamship in 1807, which has cut this trip from the old world to the new world in about a third. And so that makes things much, much easier. When you think about this date, 1890, until 1890, we have this importance of the American frontier, because as long as there is untapped land to the west, the immigrants will come, and they will come quickly and in high number. Okay. Let's talk about our Irish. Let's talk about our Germans. So why are the Irish coming over? The biggest reason, of course, the Great Famine. The potato famine hits in the mid-1840s. Very tragically, 1/4 of the entire Emerald Isle population will die of starvation. This is a very, very serious famine. And with no available food and no available wealth, the Irish are going to flock to the United States more than any other location in the world. But when they arrive, they are arriving literally with the clothing on their backs. They have nothing else to bring with them. And because of this, they can't afford to move west. To move west, you need to be able to pay for transportation. You need to be able to pay for land. You need to be able to pay for livestock and equipment. None of these things are Irish immigrants can afford. Because of this, they're going to stay in the eastern cities where they arrive, and they're going to look to get a job anywhere they can. They're going to cram into the slums, and they're going to work in the lowest, most dangerous work. And this just so happens to be the emerging industrial era where the factory system is created. And we see these early immigrants, especially the Irish, coming into work in these very crowded and dangerous industries on the eastern seaboard. They also are going to be utilized heavily for politics, politically, especially by the political machines, these eastern cities where they have these municipal governments that are governed by a political boss, like Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall in New York. More to that in our next chapter. The other immigrants, of course, are our German 48ers. Our German 48ers are Germans who were upset when there was not a unifying democratic government formed in Germany in 1848. And many of them are then going to come to the United States, either for that political reason or because they're looking for land and opportunity, perhaps crop failures in Germany. And when they arrive, however, they, unlike the Irish, are going to have some money in their pockets. They can afford to move to the West. They can afford to buy land out West. And many, in fact, do move out to the West where the available land is. And when they do so, they largely are going to be a little bit more spread out than the Irish. The Irish, again, are congregating only on the eastern seaboard. And because the Germans are able to afford land throughout the Midwest, we see that not as influential politically because they're more spread out, but they are going to have a huge cultural impact on the Midwest. For instance, they're going to bring with them a love of public education. They are going to vote again and again for public education. They're going to bring in cultural things into education like kindergarten. They're also going to bring with them the old world drinking habits. They're going to drink large quantities of beer, which is going to upset many of our temperance advocates who become especially numerous in this age. Especially after the Second Great Awakening, which is 1800 to 1820. Every time there are lots of immigrants, there is a spike in nativism. And our nativists, and no matter what time period in the United States history, are saying the same things. We want to limit immigration because immigrants are taking away American jobs. In this time and in other times, there's calls that they will outbreed and outvote Americans. And there is also a fear of Catholicism. That is a big one because Catholicism, of course, is our country was formed by Protestants and largely religious dissenters moving away from Catholicism in the old world. And here we have our Irish coming in who are virtually all Catholic. And then we have our Germans who are less than half of them are Catholic, but it's a strong minority. And because of this, Catholicism becomes really much more widespread in the United States in this time period between 1840 to 1860 until, in fact, in 1850, Catholicism becomes the number one most practiced denomination of Christianity in the United States. Wow. In each time period where we see a spike in nativism, there is some sort of political party that comes together to oppose immigration. In this case, it's the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, better known as the Know Nothing Party, who fights especially locally but also nationally to get restrictions on immigration. In this 1840 to 1860 time period, the U.S. has become a pluralistic society. And in fact, one of the most ethnically and racially varied in the history of the world. And the reason why, when we have this amount of cultural diversity, do we not see more violent clashes occur? Because we have seen in the past, in history, when we see diasporas of this kind, that we do see violence. Why wasn't there more violence in the United States? The answer is because there's available land and wealth. There was enough land and wealth to go around that the U.S. economy could actually absorb these immigrants coming in and had a place for these immigrants, jobs for these immigrants. And in fact, most historians agree that these immigrants brought new ideas and technology that helped the United States prosper. And certainly the laborers coming in took the jobs that the quote unquote native Americans did not want to take, such as building canals and laying railroad tracks, etc. Speaking of immigrants, we have an English immigrant by the name of Samuel Slater. Samuel Slater he's an Englishman and he works in a textile factory. And of course, the British were masters of the textile industry because of their first inventions and things like the spinning jenny, right? These textile machines. And Samuel Slater is going to be the first British immigrant to come into the United States, bringing with him the plans to make the sewing machine. He actually literally memorizes the plans to create a sewing machine, comes to the United States, forms a plant in Rhode Island, and forms one of the first textile manufacturing industries in the United States. Once these textile machines are really flourishing, especially in Britain, there is this high demand for cotton. But there's a problem with that. Cotton is very difficult to cultivate. It takes a long time to cultivate. It's very slow and it's very expensive. And the stat that our textbook gives us is that handpicking 1 pound of cotton was a full day's work. And that is why the cotton gin is so monumental. The creation of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 completely transforms the economy of not just the South, but also really the North and the manufacturing region of the United States as well. We see this has a profound impact on the American economy because it makes harvesting cotton 50 times more effective. And this has tremendous amounts of effects. So the effects of the cotton change or the cotton gin, obviously raising cotton becomes more profitable, and now the South is going to adapt and transform to adapt to this change. They are going to transform into a monopolistic one crop economy in which large plantations of the snowy white crop is going to span over miles and miles and miles. Also, we see that our former planters, especially in South Carolina and Georgia, have been using this land for a long time for whatever it was, rice or indigo or tobacco. Lots of this land has been used, over cultivated. And so what this is going to do is it's going to cause planters to want to buy more and more land to the west to build their cotton plantations. So it is going to push westward migration as well. Also, because of this new demand for plantation agriculture, unfortunately, it is going to renew the demand for slavery in the South. Now there needs to be more workers in the South to work these cotton plantations. But to say that the cotton gin only benefited the South is incorrect, because obviously, yes, it's going to benefit the South, and the South starts to become a very economically prosperous part of the United States. But also it's going to benefit the North. And it's going to benefit the North for two reasons. One, obviously, because of the manufacturing in the North, which is starting to be protected by American law with the high tariffs, the tariff of 1816, which is our first protectionist tariff, or the tariff of abominations in 1828. But not only that, but the merchants. The merchants are coming from the North. The merchants are transporting the cotton from wherever it is, New Orleans or Savannah or Charleston, and they're taking it over to England, or they're taking it up to Boston or New York. And so who is benefiting from all this? Both the North and the South, especially New England, where we see the dense population, lots of manufacturing there, the seaports, etc. Okay. So U.S. manufacturing is really meets its maturing point after the War of 1812. And in fact, the War of 1812 and the previous embargo are the turning point years of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Why? Because of the Embargo Act, to start. That's Jefferson, in second to last year as president. We can't trade. We can't trade with anyone. We can't export with anyone. So if you want manufactured goods, you got to make it yourself. And so we see manufacturing start really in 1807. We go from a pure export economy to a little bit of a manufacturing economy. And then we go into that War of 1812. We still can't trade with the British. So now we see about 8-9 years of where the U.S. is on its own in manufacturing. And because of this, this is where our first factories start to flourish. And then And after the war, we see that first tariff of 1816, which again is the first protectionist tariff in American history. Then we see the cotton gin and interchangeable parts. Interchangeable parts is huge. Eli Whitney, again, this is his move for the U.S. military. He had a deal with the American military to build rifles. Previously, rifles had been built one by one. Each and every part was built by an artisan by hands. And if one of the parts of those things broke, unfortunately, sometimes you would try to substitute it with a different part, but sometimes it wouldn't fit because they were each a little bit unique because they're made by hand. Eli Whitney says, let's mass produce things with machines, and to do so, we'll have all identical parts. That's going to help us mass produce things much quicker, and if something breaks, we can replace it easily. This becomes one of the major foundations for the factory system and the foundation of mass production and assembly line methods. But there are many other new inventions that become very important in this time period. Elias Howe invents the sewing machine, becomes pivotal for the clothing industry. This is going to change out of the cotton industry or the cottage industry or the putting out system where women would make textiles at home. Now we see these seamstresses coming into work in the factories. The Telegraph by Samuel Morse. This is a huge one, right? Being able to communicate over long distances instantaneously. This is going to help business, obviously, because you can order something from very far away and then have it transported via ship, perhaps on a canal, or if we get into the 1840s, by railroad. Congress is going to apportion $30,000 to build telegraph lines throughout the country. Also, the principle of limited liability, which means that you're only liable for your initial investment in a respected business venture. All of these things are going to encourage investments in the United States and make the United States into the industrial giant that it becomes. By the time we get to the Civil War, we are the actual highest producing country in the world because of the perfect storm of laissez-faire government, inventions, cheap labor, and lots of resources. But of course, this has social effects on the people of the United States, especially in the North. And this is where the South gets very frustrated with the criticisms of slavery, because the Northern workers are in very, very terrible conditions. And the South calls these Northern workers wage slaves because they are working 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, is incredibly unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and there are virtually no laws that protect the worker in the workplace. Very long hours, children as young as 6 and 7 years of age working in these factories, and yet there are no laws prohibiting this, and labor unions are forbidden by law. There is no way that labor unions are allowed to form. They're viewed as enemies of free trade and therefore illegal. However, in 1840, really the only positive thing that we learn about Martin Van Buren is that he establishes the 10-day workday for federal employees. And many states are going to look at this as one of the first bargaining pieces, protecting the worker. And then there's a Supreme Court case that is going to be very pivotal in American history as far as rights of the worker, because there are strikes in the 1830s and 40s, obviously, with the working conditions, but workers are going to lose more strikes than they win because business owners have all of the power. They can literally fire you if they go on strike. They can say, okay, if you're not going to work in the factory that requires unskilled labor anyway, then we're going to hire Irish straight off of the boat to come in and work for us. And because of this, we see that unions didn't really have much power. In Commonwealth v. Hunt, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rules that labor unions are in fact not illegal conspiracies, and this is the first Supreme Court win for labor unions in a very long uphill road that is going to go all the way up until the 1950s before the rights of workers are truly recognized and realized. And then after the 1950s, we actually see a decline in union rights. Women, guys, a big point of this time period is the changing roles of women. And when we start to see the Industrial Revolution in this time period, as early as 1807 with the Embargo Act, women have horrendous rights, depending on the state, but still horrendous rights. if we go back into the colonial era, women are largely working in the fields with their husbands, and they're working on these small subsistence farms with their children. And now we see that these new factories, especially textile factories, change the rules for women, because lots of the things that the wife produced or the mother produced at home, like clothing, spinning yarn, etc., is now being done in a factory. And so now we're going to see factory work comes open and available for women. And so we start to see, especially young girls and especially single women, coming in and working in the factories. These factory girls work 6 days a week, 12 to 13-hour days. And you see some of these establishments, like the Lower Mill Girls in Massachusetts, that literally regulate and own every part of these girls' lives. They live in communal dormitories that are owned by the factory. They go and eat in a communal cafeteria owned by the factory. They work all day to the sounds of bills and regimented times in which they're working, and then they go back and they sleep in their communal dorms also owned by the factory. It is a crazy regimented life in which the factory and the business owner is the one that is truly benefiting from this exchange. But we do see that these factory jobs do, for the first time, offer women and single women some greater economic independence. However, when I say greater, that's still the fact remains. It's still, by the time women are married, the average women are married in the antebellum era, only a fifth of them have worked in any capacity. And still, to be able to make enough money to really live off of, that is very, very rare. Most of the job opportunities were still in nursing, domestic service, or teaching, which becomes kind of those pink collar ghettos that we talk about in the next era. Also, we see that the rights for women are incredibly, incredibly poor in this time period. First of all, if you were working, that meant you were single. And once you were married, you were expected to leave your job. And what starts to happen is that there is this belief that if you have to work, that means that you or your husband or your family is poor. That in fact, it is supposed to be a sign of class and a sign of privilege that you can be able to and afford to stay at home with the children and be a homemaker. This is this glorification of being a housewife. And that is a 19th century belief called the cult of domesticity, where there is this glorification of staying home and being a traditional homemaker. And that this is the idea of the mother was that the women are the leaders of the household, and they get to make family decisions and regulate their children and how their children are raised, where the men are the sovereigns outside of the household. Now, obviously, this is a sexist belief in the time period, and it represents a change because we've gone from Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity, and it sounds like it's not much of a change. But I think one thing that is important here to understand is increasingly able to make family decisions within the home. Now, that idea that the mothers, the women, were the regulators of familial decisions at home is going to cause women after the Second Great Awakening to start to say, well, if we get to regulate the home and we get to regulate our children, then we need to have access to politics in realms that deal with children, such as child labor laws, these sorts of things. And so this view of women, this cult of domesticity, while of course it's incredibly sexist for this time period, is a step towards political power, at least in a very small sense. Okay. So now to economics. So the West. So obviously, guys, we always talk about the North and the South and the differing views of slavery. But the West has become its own economy, and we need to understand the transportation of all the regions of the United States to understand how sectionalism and politics are how they differ in these different regions. So first of all, the West, and you can look at this kind of shaded area over here in the West to understand exactly what is determined as the West. The western portion of Pennsylvania, which obviously is one of the original 13, and all the way through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Tennessee. This is the West. These are areas that do not have access to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you don't have access to the Atlantic Ocean, you have a very difficult time to make your economy. Because if you want, for instance, become a farmer and you want to become a corn farmer or a wheat farmer, which so many of our Western people did, then you need to be able to export your crops. But if you're going to export it to the Atlantic seaboard, which of course you would want to be able to do so you can trade it up and down the East Coast, or make your way all the way down to the south, or even go all the way over to Europe, you need to somehow be able to transport it over hundreds of miles of land. And because we don't yet have massive roads or canals or all these things, how are you going to be able to transport your crops to the buyers, the consumers? The answer to that is the ever important Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is the key in connecting the West to the rest of the United States. The Mississippi has several tributaries and tributary rivers: the Illinois River, the Ohio River, the Tennessee River, the Missouri River, all of these different rivers. And if you live along one of these rivers or close enough to these rivers, you can bring your crops to these rivers, connect it to the Mississippi, sail down to the port at New Orleans, and then sell your crops to a merchant there that can sell your crops anywhere it wants to go, over to Europe, what have you. And so the Mississippi River is absolutely key in being able to trade your crops if you're out west. And so with this ability to sell crops in mass volumes, the West becomes a sectional economy. It becomes based in corn and wheat and hogs and pigs and livestock. This is the food, the bread basket of the country, and it feeds the rest of the country, and can do so because of new technology like, one, the John Deere steel plow that's pulled by a horse and can break soil, and especially Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper. This is the cotton gin of the West. It's 5 times more productive than cutting wheat with a scythe or a sickle. And because this makes wheat so profitable, we see that thousands of subsistence farmers — when you say a subsistence farmer, that is a farmer that beforehand had made food only for their family, and it grown. They have a couple of pigs, a couple of chickens, maybe a cow, and they're going to live off of the land, just feeding themselves and their family. Now subsistence farmers, because of machines like this, the McCormick Reaper, are going to turn to cash crop agriculture. They're going to buy more and more land. They're going to cultivate lots of wheat. They're going to buy this mechanical reaper, and they're going to try to strike it rich. But there's a problem with that. Because so many Western farmers are doing the exact same thing, buying more land, cultivating wheat, buying this mechanical reaper, what we have is a huge overproduction of crops. And we have all of these constant demand to buy more land, buy more machines, and our Western farmers are always in debt. And that, of course, is a theme of the West: constant and perpetual debt. But they need to have all of this food, because there was a lot of hungry mouths to feed, especially on the slave plantations down in the South. Okay. So now we have a connection between the West and the South, which of course is the Mississippi River. But how do you bring food to the Northeast without sailing all the way down the Mississippi and then sailing all the way up around the eastern seaboard? There needs to be man-made creations to connect the West to the East. And that is going to be our first roads and canals. The Lancaster Turnpike, for instance, is a paved road 62 miles from Lancaster to Philly, which is only in Pennsylvania. The Cumberland Road, also called the National Road, which is paid for by the federal governments in the states, one of the few internal improvements that were allowed in the Monroe era, 591 miles from Maryland to Illinois. So coming across, so this is one of the major ways in which transportation occurred. But more so than the roads was the invention of the steamboat, which creates the canal cutting craze. The steamboat is huge. Steamboat is huge for a couple of reasons. For one, of course, obviously, it's a faster ship, which allows you to cut down travel times, but also it allows access to go upstream. When you think about the Mississippi River, for instance, if you live in Illinois and you want to trade to the south of you, you literally take the Mississippi River, you follow the current all the way down, no problem. Here's the problem. If you took your ship all the way down the Mississippi, you can't sail it back up. the current is too strong. And so literally you would have to take apart your ship and tow it back up with horses, which could be extremely time consuming and expensive. But with the steamboat, everything changes. Now you just steam right back up the Mississippi River, right back to your farm, and you do it again. The steamboat is key, and now there needs to be more man-made rivers that go from west to east so that we can connect all of these western farms with their wheat and their corn to the populous northeastern cities. And so we need canals, and the best example of which is the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is going to connect Lake Erie all the way over to New York, and in doing so, coming across New York, starting in Buffalo, we now have the 363-mile canal that makes it all the way over to the Hudson River. The Hudson River takes you all the way down to the Atlantic Ocean. So if you ever any way can touch the Great Lakes, you can then move your goods to the Atlantic Ocean. This is huge. It's a huge man-made feat in 1825. It is going to drastically increase trade from west to east. And so now farming in the Old Northwest becomes much more profitable. We now have a connected country from west to northeast, and with the Mississippi River west to south. Of course, the Iron Horse, the railroad, becomes a very, very profitable and significant contributor to transportation, but especially in the 1850s and 60s is where we see the railroad. And if you look at the initial railroad system, here we are in 1840, so still very limited. You're almost always on the eastern seaboard and almost always in the northeast, where we see lots of the richest Americans building their railroads. So to sum up all this transportation discussion, we have a connected nation at this stage. The steamboat is going to bind the South and the West, right? The West, you can take the Mississippi River down to the South and then right back up. So we have a connection with the Mississippi. The Erie Canal connects the Old Northwest and the East, right? Coming across this way. Also our roads, of course, are going to connect it. And each region now, because of this transportation, can specialize in a particular type of economic activity. The South is raising cotton. They're going to export to New England and to a much bigger extent to Britain. Britain is still by far the biggest buyer of Southern cotton. The West is going to grow grain and livestock to feed the rest of the country, the East, the South, and Europe. And then, of course, the East, manufacturing, machines, textiles, etc. And then we finally get to our last discussion, which is the Second Great Awakening and the great reforms that ensue afterwards. Like our First Great Awakening, it is a roaring revival of religion. We see this sweeping religious movement that comes from the South and sweeps through the United States. More and more people become religious, want a relationship with God. And with this Great Awakening, the religious preachers of the time period are going to deal with the social problems at hand. They're going to say that everyone is equal in the eyes of God, and therefore there needs to be reforms to match this equality. And there are things that need to be reformed, where we see democratic ideals extended to places like prisons. We also need to protect women especially, and that's going to encourage the temperance movement. We'll see the women's movement, and then the big one, slavery, which becomes more and more the issue that dominates American politics. We have the handsome Charles Grandison Finney, who is our preacher, our major preacher of the Second Great Awakening. Our First Great Awakening was Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield. In our Second Great Awakening, it's Charles Grandison Finney. He is going to address huge crowds up in the north in Rochester and New York City. And the big thing about Finney is that he is going to encourage women to pray aloud in public. This before had been completely forbidden for women. But in an effort for churches to bring women into religion, the Second Great Awakening, we saw a feminization of religion, which is absolutely key in American history. Also for Finney, because he's from the North, he's going to denounce alcohol and slavery. This becomes a very hot topic in the Second Great Awakening, and it's going to be a divisive topic that's going to literally divide churches of the same denomination, depending on if the church is in the North or the South. So our effects of the Second Great Awakening are really very simple. The first one is the feminization of religion. The majority of new people now going to church are women. And because we have all of these social issues brought up, this gives a chance for women to leave the home and to get interacted and invested in politics. We especially see middle class women in New England join these political efforts with a little bit more wealth. Not having to work in the factories, this allows women to come into the political sphere. The other thing that's going to happen with the Second Great Awakening is it's going to increase sectionalism and debates over slavery, because we have the exact same churches, right, like the Baptists or the Methodists, that are preaching very different things in the North and the South. In the North, they're very anti-slavery. In the South, they're saying slavery is protected by the Bible and mentioned in the Bible and these things. So we see even more churches and denominations out of the Second Great Awakening. Another person that was touched by the Second Great Awakening was the 24-year-old Joseph Smith, who is going to receive golden plates from an angel, decipher the words upon these plates into the Book of Mormon, our first American religion. All of these religions that we've discussed before have in some way originated in Europe. This is our first American religion, now the Church of Latter-day Saints. And this is going to have a very profound impact upon American society and eventually world society. And it's worth mentioning as well that this also is very characteristic of the time period. For one, obviously because of the Second Great Awakening, we have this spurring of new religion, but it's also characteristic of the time period because it's very utopian in practice, which we do see these utopian societies emerge in this time period as well. And what I mean by that is that Joseph Smith and the first Mormons are going to move from place to place with the idea of wanting to build a Mormon society, an American Zion. They move together. There's whispers of polygamy. Wherever they go, they vote entirely as a unit, and so they're going to come in and disrupt local politics and state politics. They move to Ohio. Then they move to Illinois. In Illinois, the newspapers are going to start attacking the Mormons for their polygamy. Joseph Smith and his brother are going to come in and ransack the newspaper editor's office. And because of this, he's arrested. And then in jail, a mob comes in and kills Joseph Smith. And that seems like it might be the end of it. But no, Brigham Young grabs the torch from Joseph Smith and starts to lead the church. He's called the Mormon Moses because he leads the Mormons out of Illinois and out to, at this time, a total Western frontier location, Utah, where we see the Mormons flourish in this atmosphere, especially out at Salt Lake City. And Utah, despite having the amount of territorial population needed to become a new state, Utah is going to be one of our last states to enter the Union all the way in 1896 because of the continued practices of polygamy out there in Utah. Reformers. Dorothea Dix. She is a New Englander, and she is devoutly and very passionately devoted to reforming the treatment of the mentally ill. Mentally ill, completely misunderstood in this time period. They're treated as felons. They're treated as criminals. They're thrown in jail. And Dorothea Dix is going to travel over 60,000 miles to visit insane asylums around the country and then return back to New England to the Massachusetts legislature to speak of their conditions. And she is known for popularizing the notion that mental illness is in fact just that, is an illness. And we see different state legislatures, starting with Massachusetts, improving the conditions of asylums, and as I mentioned, more awareness of mental illness. Another big one is the temperance movement. 1826, once again in New England, we see the American Temperance Society, where drinkers are being asked to sign the temperance pledge, do not drink. They'll use pictures and propaganda to encourage people. Maine becomes the first state to ban manufacture and sale of liquor. And it says on there that other states follow, although this is kind of a misnomer because many of these states are openly flouted, or many of these laws are later found to be unconstitutional by their state constitutions or by the state legislatures or the Supreme Court. So in fact, we really don't see temperance on a large scale until we get into the 1920s, where we actually see the temperance prohibition passed into law. And then the second best-selling book behind Uncle Tom's Cabin in the Antebellum period is 10 Nights in a Barroom and What I Saw There, a realistic fiction about a quiet town that a bar opens up and everything goes to hell. Okay, once again, the women's movements. The big change after the Second Great Awakening is the rights of women, and this again in this time period, women's rights are awful. Women can't vote. When they marry, they pass their property to their husband. They're expected to be completely subordinate to their husband. We've talked about the cult of domesticity. In fact, in some states, women could legally be beaten as long as it was what, quote, a reasonable instrument. I mean, this is how bad things are. And in the industrial era, women are especially criticized because they're seen as unequal and that they can't do the same amount of work that men can do in the factories. But they reason that women are morally stronger and thus they are the keepers of society's conscience and must aid the children in their cult of domesticity. So, load of crap. And this is going to bring women like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony to come in and fight for change. And so many of these women, again, are coming from wealthy or middle class white families, especially in New England, influenced by the Second Great Awakening, and influenced by the social activities of the time, especially temperance and abolition. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker. She's coming from Pennsylvania. She's going to form the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, and then she's going to travel all the way to London to participate in the World Anti-Slavery Society. And she's denied a seat once she gets there just because she's a woman. And this is going to really profoundly change her and affect her because she says, I've traveled 3,000 miles to London to be at this conference and you are denying me a seat because I'm a woman. How can me being a woman affect whether or not I believe slavery is right or wrong? And so she then is going to become a passionate women's rights activist, a feminist, and she is going to help organize the first women's rights convention, the Seneca Falls Convention, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is a New Englander. She helps organize Seneca Falls. After Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to work with Susan B. Anthony to establish the National Women's Suffrage Association, actually the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is, of course, NASA. Susan B. Anthony creates The Revolution, which is a weekly publication that lobbies for women's rights. Also, she is going to try to vote for Victoria Woodhull in 1872. She votes illegally because women can't vote until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. She's arrested and fined $100, but she never pays it, which I love about her. She is going to fight for what she believes in, and she's not going to be punished for it. Seneca Falls Convention, 1848, it is a key date. It is our first women's rights convention in history. It's taking place in New York. There are 300 people there, some men, but mostly women. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is going to read the documents, the Declaration of Sentiments, which is modeled after the Declaration of Independence, but it is going to add women in very pointedly in places where women are omitted. For instance, all men and women are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This is going to launch the modern women's rights movement and inspire other women's rights conventions around the world. And this is going to bring to attention that women must be receiving more rights in respective countries. However, unfortunately for women, while this is the first, it will be a long road to suffrage. And the biggest reason why is because the abolition movement really takes the stage in reform in this time period. We're in our last three slides now. Transcendentalism becomes an important concept. It's kind of it is in fact a religion, and it rejects one of the long-standing beliefs for over 100 years from the Enlightenment that all knowledge comes from the senses. This was a John Locke notion, and instead, transcendentalism is the belief that truth transcends the senses. It passes through it. It comes around it, and that each person has this inner light and relationship that puts them in direct touch with God. Now, transcendentalism, it's kind of a difficult concept to explain, but in practice, what it means is that because each person has an inner light and a relationship with God, this means that no matter what color, no matter what sex, you are in fact have this personal relationship with God. And so it is going to give lots of dignity and respect to the individual of any type, race, sex, ethnicity, what have you. And so that then leads to more fighting for social rights and civil liberties. And we have two classic American transcendentalists, both of which are from Boston. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is an author and a poet and a philosopher, and he also is a believer of exploring American nature. And Henry David Thoreau, who condemns the U.S. government for supporting slavery, very transcendentalist thing to do, also writes on the duty of civil disobedience, who inspires Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King. If you were asked a question about literature in the time period, this is where you would use transcendentalism as an influence in this time period, as our Bostonian authors were especially the biggest writers of the antebellum period. And then our last and final slide, the wilderness utopias. There were several attempts because of the Second Great Awakening to go out and form utopian societies for human betterment, to live these perfect religious ways of life, because of course is this large amounts of wilderness where you could attempt something like this. The first one was actually called New Harmony in Indiana in 1825, which fell apart, as all of these societies eventually do. They really truly are communistic societies, really every one of them, because you are sharing everything that you have and sharing an economy of living. Brook Farm in Massachusetts, they attempt to form a society based off of transcendentalism. Its economics are going to fall into debt, especially because of a great fire in 1840 that's going to kind of cause it to fall apart. And then the Oneida community, which is a fascinating situation. And they share everything. They have shared economics, but they also had shared lovers in this really strange, very secret society where there wasn't any formal marriages, and that you shared everyone in the society. Very strange. And it's going to flourish only because one of the members of the community is going to get a patent for superior steel traps that were tremendously effective in catching otters and beavers. And because of this, he made a fortune. And then because of communism, had to spread it throughout the community. Classic. Okay, so here is your DBQ prompts. Historians have traditionally labeled the period between 1815 and 1825 the era of good feelings. Evaluate the accuracy of this label, considering the emergence of nationalism and sectionalism. We have 5 documents here. Of course, one that is not text-based as per the DBQ test. What a Friday, guys. We got through our Unit 4. I hope you guys found this to be mostly review, and I will see you guys, I believe, on Tuesday to discuss the DBQ and your weekends and all these wonderful things. Have a great weekend at APUSH, and I will talk to you soon.